guys, welcome back to my channel. I'm so glad you stopped by today because today we are going to be turning a DACHSHUND into a dragon. So basically, I've done fusion videos before where I'll take two different creatures and blend them together and make something, and I wanted to do something similar to that. So I got the idea to do this mainly because my immediate family tends to have a lot of DACHSHUNDs, and currently we have 4 of them in the family. Actually, one of them was adopted less than a week ago from this time of filming. I actually made this doll before we had the 4th one added to the pack. So I thought that was kind of funny timing. Anyways, let's get started. Okay guys, so the first thing that I'm going to start working on is the clay pieces. So I'm going to start on the head and then we'll make the paws. So for the head, I have a lump of tin foil kind of roughly shaped into a cone, and we're going to start covering this in clay. So I'm just going to take some strips of clay, wrap it around our tin foil, and then blend everything together to get a basic base down for what we're going to work with. Once we have everything covered and smoothed out, we can then start focusing on the shape of the head a little bit more. So I'm just going to start using my fingers for this. With such a basic shape, we're not really getting into a lot of detail right now. We don't need tools just yet. So with this piece, I do want to add a little hint of dragon quality to it, but I really want to keep that DACHSHUND quality as well. So I'm focusing heavily on getting that shape for the head so that it actually looks like a DACHSHUND. So once I have a basic shape down, I'm happy with it and it somewhat looks like a DACHSHUND head, I'm going to start adding the details. So normally the first detail that I like to add with my faces are the eyes. This one we're not going to use glass eyes. I really didn't have anything that I liked to go with it, so I'm just going to be using clay for them. So I'm going to take some balls of clay. You'll want to make sure that they're nice and even, and then we're going to place them on the head where we want the eyes to go. I'm going to kind of push them down and adjust the shape of them so that they're positioned correctly, and then we're going to take strips of clay to make the bottom eyelid and the top eyelid. When we're adding the upper eyelid, I am also going to be adding some balls of clay to add a bit of a brow to the face. Once I have the clay laid out for the eyelids, I'm then going to start blending it into the rest of the face and really cleaning up the edges going around the eye. After that, we're going to move on to making the nose and the mouth. So I'm going to start with the front of the face first, and I'm going to add some balls of clay to the very front to kind of make it where the lips stick out a little bit more. I'm going to get those placed. I'm going to blend the clay into the rest of the face so everything is nice and smooth again, and then I'm going to use a tool to scratch out the shape of the rest of the mouth. So I'm going to go down the sides of the face until I know roughly about where the lips would stop. Once I have a basic shape for the mouth laid out and they're both even on both sides, I'm then going to use my tools to refine the shape and clean it up a little bit more. And then after we have the mouth done, we're going to work on the nose. For the nose, I'm pretty sure I made it a little bit too large for a DACHSHUND, but again, we're making our DACHSHUND into a dragon, so I didn't think it was too bad. I am still going to be making it a dog nose. I'm not going to be making a dragon nose or anything like that. The dragon qualities of this piece are going to be kind of subtle. I figured if I went too dragon with it, it could be hard to recognize the DACHSHUND, so we are going to be making a dog nose. So for this, I'm going to be using my tools to indent and make the holes for the nostrils and break up the nose into the proper segments to make the shape of the nostrils. Lastly, I'm going to add a texture to the nose, and I'm just going to use a simple dotting tool for this. So at this point, we pretty much have all of our DACHSHUND details in place, and now it's time to add a little bit more of a dragon quality to the piece. So for this, I'm mainly just going to be adding scales. I'm going to be doing the front of the muzzle, and I'm also going to be doing a little bit under the eyes. So for the front of the muzzle, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use my tools and I'm going to break up the clay into individual scales. And then for the scales that I want to go under the eyes, I'm going to use balls of clay and I'm going to kind of stack them on top of each other in like a little line. I'll add a little bit of texture to them, and then I'm going to move on to just adjusting things here and there, cleaning up my edges. And then once I like the shape of the head and everything all on it, I'm going to end up putting it in the oven for about probably 45 minutes at 275 Fahrenheit. Now when it comes to making the feet, I tend to like to make the paw pads separate and then add them afterwards. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to lay out a little bit of clay flat on a surface, and then I'm going to start adding balls of clay to it to make the paw pads. So I'm going to lay those out, make sure they're in the position that I like them, and I'm going to use my tools to adjust the basic shape of them so that they're rounded and they look a little bit more like toe pads instead of just balls of clay. Also, I like to do all the pads for the feet at the same time. That way it's easier to make them nice and even. And then once I'm happy with the basic shape of the paw pads, I'm going to add a slight bit of texture to them, and then I'm going to clean up the edges so there's no excess clay around them. And then I can put these in the oven for about 25 minutes to bake at our normal 275 Fahrenheit temperature. And then once our paw pads are out of the oven and have cooled to touch, I'm going to add them to some wires. So I bent some very simple wires with some loops at the end, and we're going to be gluing our paw pads to these loops. So I'm just going to use a little bit of hot glue. I'm going to make sure they're glued into place, let that cool, and then we can start adding our clay to the wire frame. When it comes to the front feet, we're not going to be adding as much clay as when we get to the back feet. We're mainly going to be adding clay to the top of the paw pad to make the top of the foot and to shape the very tops of all the toes and everything. But when we get to the back feet, we're going to be adding a lot more clay to the wire frame because we're going to extend the shape of the foot. It's going to be a little bit longer. So I'm going to get that basic shape laid out, and then we're going to start adjusting the shape of the toes. So I'm going to add a little bit more clay to the very front of the foot, just right over the tops of the toe pads, and then I'm going to break those up into toes. So we're just going to use our tools to kind of separate the clay into 4 individual pieces of clay, and then we're going to use our other tools to kind of soften them to make it look a little bit more rounded and not just like there's a line cut through the clay. I'm also going to be using another tool to cut away any excess clay that's kind of overlapping the toe pads in a weird way. So I'm just going to clean those lines up to make them look a little bit smoother, and then we can add a texture of fur over this. So I'm going to add my fur texture to the tops of the toes and the sides of the feet, make sure that I like that, and then we're going to start adding some scales to the tops of the feet as well. So for this, it's going to be kind of a larger version of what we did with the scales going underneath the eyes. And we're just going to take some balls of clay, kind of make them a little bit more oval shape, and then we're going to lay them on top of the foot and kind of go over each other. And then I'm going to use my tools again to clean up the edges and to add a texture to them. So for the front feet, we're just going to be adding like 2 scales. There's really not enough room for more, but when it comes to the back feet, we're going to go all the way up. And then once we're done making all of our clay feet, we're going to put these in the oven for a final bake at 275 Fahrenheit for about 45 minutes. Once all of our clay pieces are out of the oven and have cooled to touch, we can then start painting them. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to be primering my clay pieces. So I want everything to be one solid color, and I know it looks like on camera that I'm using black, but I'm actually just using a very dark brown. So I'm starting off with the face. I'm getting it one solid color, making sure that that's completely dry, and then we're going to move on to adding different tones of brown to it to add highlights, and if we want we can darken it, but I'm pretty sure it's dark enough as it is. So I decided to go with more of a redder brown, and then I went over it with kind of a white to kind of dust over it a little bit and make it look a little paler. So for the majority of the face, I'm not going to add a ton of detail because I want to add a fur texture over most of it. So I'm just going to add the basic colors and then move on to the details. So for the details, the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to paint the scales going underneath the eyes. And I decided to go with kind of a baby pink. So I went over those, and while those were drying, I decided to go over the eyes and the nose with a black. And then after that, the scales on the snout, I decided to go with a blue. I figured blue and pink looked really nice together, especially with the brown. And then after that, I let everything dry a little bit, and then I took a little bit more white and I dusted over the scales, just like I did with the rest of the face. While doing this, I also added a little bit of a white highlight to the tip of the nose. Lastly, I decided I wanted to add a little bit of gold detail to this, so I went over a little bit on the scales on the snout and I just added gold to the very tips of the scales. Moving on to the feet, these are going to be pretty simple. We're going to use all the same colors, they're just going to be a little bit differently placed. So I'm going to start like we did with the face, and we're going to primer all of our feet a nice dark brown. We're going to let that dry, and then once it's dried, we can add our highlights. We're going to use a little bit of that red brown and that white. Now all the scales on the feet are going to be that pink, so we're not going to be using any of that blue until we get to the paw pads. I figured we could add it there. So I'm going to be painting all of the scales a nice pink. Now I'm not going to add any major detail to this other than getting the color solid. That's because we're going to be adding glitter once we're done with all the clay pieces. So I painted the scales pink, and then I painted the paw pads blue. And just like with the scales on the face, once those were dried, I dusted over them with a white. And then lastly, I wanted to add a little bit of gold like we did with the face. So since we added gold to the blue scales, I thought it made sense to add gold to the blue paw pads. So I'm just going to add little gold polka dots on them. And then after that, before we can do anything else to them, I need to let everything dry, and then I'm going to paint a layer of resin over everything. So everything is getting completely covered in resin except for the face. We're only going to be resining the details because we're going to be furring it. So the following day, once all that resin is completely cured, we can start adding glitter to the pieces. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to be adding pink glitter to the pink scales. And how I'm going to be doing this is adding more resin to it. But I have to do this slightly different. The reason we can't do this the same time we resin the rest of it is because the glitter would basically get on everything, and I only want it in one specific spot. So for doing this, what I did, I mixed up a very small amount of resin, and then I very, very lightly went over those scales. You want to make sure to very lightly go over it because you don't want your resin to drip. You just want it to make the surface sticky so that the glitter has something to stick to. And then once you have your surface painted over with that thin layer of resin, we just have to sprinkle on our glitter. Now if you don't want to use resin for this, you don't want to wait for it to dry, you can use glue, but you do risk the glitter kind of coming off more easily. With the resin, you really lock it in there and you don't have to worry about it spreading glitter throughout everything. The only thing you'll have to do is once the resin is completely cured is take a brush and kind of brush away any excess glitter that didn't stick into the resin. And then you're pretty much good, none of the other glitter should come off. Okay, so now we can start working on the sewing. So I have a pattern all drawn out and I did my best to make it look as DACHSHUND as possible. So at the very top I have a piece, and this is going to be for the chest. I have the main body, the legs, and a little piece of fabric that's going to be used to make wings. So I'm going to use my pattern pieces and we're going to get all of our fabric cut out and we're going to start sewing. So first thing that we're going to do is we're going to take the pieces for the sides. So I have the sides of the neck and the sides of the body, and we're going to be sewing these together. And then I'm going to take our side pieces and we're going to be sewing them to the chest portion, and this is also kind of the lower portion of the neck. So we're going to start at the very base of the neck and sew these together right here. And then after that we can do the sewing for the legs. So each leg has an inside portion and an outside portion, and we're going to be taking those and we're going to be sewing down the fronts of them, connecting them together. So we're going to do this for the front legs and the back legs. So sewing wise, that's pretty much all that we can do right now. Now we're going to work on the feathers for the wings and the tail. We're going to also add feathers to the tail just to add a little bit more decoration to the piece. So I have all the feathers cut out using felt. I just kind of roughly sketched everything out to where they could be layered. And what we're going to do is we're going to add a little bit of detail to this first. So I'm going to be using my fabric markers and I'm going to be drawing in some lines and just adding some decoration to the fronts of the feathers. And for the coloring, I wanted the feathers to match the scales, so I have them a baby blue and a baby pink. And then once you have the details sketched out on the feathers, you're going to let them dry for a little bit, and then you're going to take your fabric glue and start gluing the layers together. So I'm going to start layering my feathers, let that dry, and then we're going to take the fabric for the tail and the wings, and we're going to glue those in place as well. So I made this part really simple. You're just going to glue one side and then fold the fabric over onto the other side of the feathers. Okay, so all of our individual pieces for our art doll are nice and done and they're ready to be assembled. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a wire frame. I made a pretty simple one ahead of time, and we're going to start adding the fabric for the body onto this. So for this, we're going to figure out where the wires for the legs need to go. We're going to cut some holes into the fabric and then run the wire frame through those. And then I'm going to be taking our clay head and I'm going to glue this to the wire for the neck. You'll want to let that dry a little bit, and then you can take the fabric for the neck and glue around the base of the head. After that, I'm going to take the wings and I'm going to slide them onto the wires for the wings, and we're going to be sewing those in place on the body. So I had to cut some tiny little slits into the fabric for where the wings are going to go, so I just sewed those in place real quick, and then I did the same thing to the tail. We just added that to the wire and then sewed that in place on the body too. Once we had those in place, we're then going to stuff our body and close it up. So I'm going to start at the very top of the head and I'm going to work my way down until I get to the base of the tail. Once you have the body stuffed and closed up, we're then going to start shaving it. So for now, I'm mainly going to be just shaving the sides so it's easier to add the legs. And then once we have all of that fur out of the way, we can take the fabric for the legs and sew those in place as well. So what we're going to do is we're going to take the under portion of the leg and we're going to sew that under the wire, and then we're going to take the outer portion and sew it over the wire. That way the wire is inside of the leg when you're done. So I'm going to do this to the front and back legs. Once those are sewn into place, we're then going to adjust the length of our wires and we're going to add our clay pieces to the ends of them. So I'm just going to use a smaller gauge wire and I'm going to wrap the wires that are sticking out of the back of our clay pieces, and I'm going to add them to the wire frame. Once you have all the paws connected to the wire frame, we can then take the fabric for the legs and we can glue them around the bases of the feet. So we're just going to take a little bit more fabric glue and we're going to glue those in place, let them dry, and then we can stuff and close up the back of all of our legs. And then once the legs are all sewn, we can shave those down as well, and we can readjust the shape of the body as much as we want until we're happy with it. So I actually shaved the body of our creature quite a bit for this piece. Now of course we can't have a dachshund without those big ears, so I'm going to be making those real quick and then we're going to be furring the face. So for this, I sketched out a basic ear shape for our dachshund, and I made sure that it was a good size to go with the rest of the body. I used this pattern and I cut out 2 pieces of felt, one for each ear, and then I glued our pieces of felt to the backing of our fur fabric, the same fabric that we used for everything else. I let my fabric glue dry and then I flipped our ears over and I shaved the backing of the ears. So the fur fabric is going to be the outer portion and then the felt is going to be the inner portion of the ears. It was also just easier to shave the fabric when it was all connected than to wait until we had the ears cut out. So once we had our fur fabric shaved, I'm then going to cut our ears out, and then I'm going to use a little bit more of my fabric markers to adjust the color of the inside of the ears and kind of cleaning up the edges of them. Those of course are going to have to dry for a little bit, but then once they're dried we can sew them in place on the body. And then after those are in place, we can fur our face. So I'm going to use our fabric glue, I'm going to lay it out where I want fur to connect to the face, and then I'm going to take some fur trimmings, sprinkle them over, push them in, and make sure that they're all nice and stuck to the face. I'm going to do basically the entire face other than the scales, and then once those are dried, I'm going to add a little bit more of my fabric markers to the snout to adjust the color a little bit. Okay guys, and this is my little dachshund dragon. I had a lot of fun with it. I think it came out pretty good. I know it's a little bit bird-like, but I wanted to go soft. I didn't want to go too reptile with it, so I figured more of a feathery type dragon would make a little bit more sense with it. Anyways, I'm going to have this little dragon up for sale in my Etsy shop, so if anyone wants to buy it and give it a new home, check the links down below. I also have links to all of the supplies that I normally use to make my art dolls, so check those down below. Those are affiliated links, so they also do support the channel. Anyways guys, thank you so much for watching. Make sure to like, subscribe, do all that fun stuff, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye!